There is a specific kind of silence that only exists after 2 a.m. It's not just the absence of noise, it's a heavy, oppressive blanket that settles over everything. It's a silence that makes you hyper-aware of your own existence, the rhythm of your breathing, the erratic thumping of your heart, the slight ringing in your ears that comes from staring at a glowing monitor for far too long. I've always been a creature of the night. As a writer, the daylight hours are too chaotic, too demanding. The world is too loud, always asking for attention, emails, calls, obligations. But the night? The night is mine. It's when the veil between reality and imagination feels the thinnest, making it the perfect time to craft the horror and suspense stories I write. But tonight, the atmosphere in my fourth-floor apartment felt different. It didn't feel inspiring, it felt stifling. I live alone in a somewhat brutalist, aging apartment building on the edge of the city, the kind of place where the hallways smell faintly of damp concrete and old dust, and the fluorescent lights flicker with an agonizing, inconsistent buzz. My apartment is at the very end of the hall, a corner unit. It's usually a blessing for the quiet, but tonight it felt like a dead end. It was 2:43 a.m. I had been staring at the same blinking cursor on my screen for the better part of an hour. The draft of my latest story was stalled. I rubbed my eyes, feeling the gritty sting of fatigue, and leaned back in my ergonomic chair, the faux leather squeaking loudly in the dead quiet of the room. The sound made me jump slightly, a pathetic testament to how tightly wound my nerves were. I was physically exhausted, but my brain was locked in a state of wired alertness. Then came the rumble, a deep, hollow ache in my stomach that demanded immediate attention. I hadn't eaten since a poorly constructed sandwich around noon. The coffee running through my veins had masked the hunger, but now the caffeine was crashing and the starvation was taking over. I unlocked my phone, the sudden brightness forcing me to squint. I opened the food delivery app, my thumb scrolling mechanically through the options. At this hour, the choices were abysmal. Closed, closed, closed. The grayed-out logos of my usual spots mocked me. All that remained were a few 24-hour convenience stores selling overpriced chips and a handful of ghostly, unknown kitchens. I settled on a place called Midnight Bites. I had never heard of it, and there were no reviews, just a generic, pixelated logo of a burger. The menu was suspiciously vast for a place operating at 3 a.m., but beggars couldn't be choosers. I tapped in an order for a double cheeseburger, fries, and a large soda. The estimated delivery time was a vague 30 to 45 minutes. The delivery fee was extortionate, but the hunger gnawing at my insides won the argument. I hit confirm, tossed the phone onto the desk, and stretched my stiff limbs. To kill time, I decided to step away from the computer. I walked into the small kitchenette, turning on the tap to splash some cold water on my face. The water pipes in this building are ancient. They shuddered and groaned behind the drywall before spitting out a stream of freezing water. I cupped my hands, brought the water to my face, and gasped at the shock of the cold. As I reached for a towel, I paused. I thought I heard something. It was faint, muffled by the walls, but it sounded like a heavy footstep in the hallway outside. I stood frozen, the towel pressed against my dripping face, straining my ears. In an apartment building, you get used to the sounds of your neighbors. You learn to filter out the muffled arguments, the television sets, the heavy walkers. But at 3 a.m., the hallway is supposed to be a dead zone. I shook my head, chiding myself. "You write too much horror," I muttered aloud. My voice sounded thin and unnatural in the empty kitchen. I was letting my own imagination bleed into reality. It was probably just the building settling or a neighbor coming home late from a night shift. I walked back to my desk, picked up my phone, and checked the app. The tracking interface was weirdly static. Usually you see a little map, a tiny car icon moving closer, or at least a status update like preparing your order. But for Midnight Bites, the screen was just a blank map grid with a single unmoving pin resting on my apartment building. No driver name, no vehicle details, just a progress bar stuck halfway. A sudden wave of exhaustion hit me. Heavy and sudden. I decided to lie down on the small sofa in the living room while I waited. I didn't turn on the main overhead light, preferring the dim, ambient glow spilling over from the computer monitor in the adjoining room. I pulled a thin throw blanket over my legs,
and closed my eyes, just for a moment. I don't know if I actually fell asleep or if I just drifted into that liminal space between wakefulness and dreaming, that strange territory where your thoughts stop making logical sense and start forming bizarre, disjointed narratives. But whatever state I was in, I was violently yanked out of it by a sound that made my blood run instantly cold. Thud, thud, thud. It wasn't the doorbell. The doorbell in my apartment is a harsh electronic chime that could wake the dead. This was a physical knock, heavy, deliberate, and authoritative. It didn't sound like someone using their knuckles. It sounded like someone striking the heavy wooden door with the flat palm of their hand, or perhaps something harder. I bolted upright on the sofa, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I stared at the front door across the dim living room. The digital clock on the microwave in the kitchen glowed a harsh neon green. 3:38 a.m. Thud. Thud. 2 more strikes, slower this time, more patient. The food, I whispered to myself, the rational part of my brain desperately trying to take control. It's just the delivery guy. You ordered food. You're an idiot. I pushed the blanket aside and stood up. My legs felt strangely weak, like they belonged to someone else. I took a deep breath, trying to force my heart rate down, and began to walk toward the door. The floorboards, which I usually knew how to navigate silently, seemed to creak with every step, betraying my approach. As I got closer, a profound sense of wrongness washed over me. It was a physical sensation, an instinctive revulsion, like the metallic taste in your mouth right before a car crash. The air in the narrow entryway felt noticeably colder than the rest of the apartment. I stopped about 3 feet from the door. Usually, when a delivery driver arrives, there's a certain chaotic energy. You hear them shifting their weight, rustling the plastic bags, maybe sighing impatiently or checking their phone. You can see the shifting shadows under the door gap from the hallway lights. But right now, nothing. No rustling paper, no shifting feet. The shadow cast beneath the door gap was pitch black and completely motionless. Whoever or whatever was standing on the other side was utterly, terrifyingly still. I swallowed hard, my throat sandpaper dry. I took the final step forward and pressed my right eye against the cold brass of the peephole. The fisheye lens distorted the dimly lit hallway, curving the walls and making the space look longer than it was. Standing directly in front of my door, so close that the lens warped his proportions, was the delivery guy. He was wearing a generic, oversized dark jacket, the hood pulled up high. But that wasn't what made my breath hitch in my throat. It was his posture. He was standing perfectly straight, his arms hanging limply at his sides, devoid of any tension or natural curve. He wasn't holding any food. No bags, no drinks, nothing. But the most unsettling part was his head. It was tilted forward at a severe, unnatural angle, his chin pressed hard into his chest. The hood shadowed his entire face. I couldn't see a nose, a mouth, or eyes, just an expanse of dark fabric and the top of a head angled downward like a broken doll. He didn't move. He didn't shift his weight. He didn't breathe. At least his chest didn't rise or fall in any discernible way. He was a statue planted on my doormat. "Hello?" I croaked, the word barely a whisper, not intended for him to hear, just to prove to myself I still had a voice. He remained motionless. The silence stretched, turning from an absence of sound into a physical pressure against my eardrums. I kept my eye glued to the peephole, terrified that if I blinked, if I looked away for even a second, he would do something. A minute passed, then 2. My eye began to water from the strain. The rational explanation was slipping away. Delivery drivers don't stand in silence without the food. They don't stand paralyzed with their heads bowed in the dead of night. They knock, they wait, they call, they leave. This person was not leaving. He was waiting. My hand hovered over the deadbolt lock. The brass felt freezing against my fingertips. A single flick of my wrist and the door would open. The urged check to confront the absurdity, to just ask, "Where is my food?" flared up briefly. But then, a deep primal instinct, the kind passed down from ancestors who knew better than to investigate the strange noise in the dark woods, screamed at me. Do not open that door. Do not let him know you are watching. I slowly pulled my hand away from the lock, backing away from the peephole inch at an agonizing inch, terrified that the floorboards would creak and give away my presence. I needed my phone. I needed to call the restaurant. I needed to cancel this, to get a voice on the line, to break this paralyzing isolation. I turned my back to the door to walk toward the living room where I had left my phone. And that's when I heard the faintest sound coming from the hallway. It wasn't a knock. It wasn't a footstep. It was a soft, wet, scratching sound right at the base of the wooden door, like fingernails trying to find a gap. The scratching sound was impossibly soft, yet it echoed in my skull like a gunshot. Scritch, scrape, scritch. It wasn't the frantic digging of an animal trying to get in. It was methodical, deliberate. It sounded exactly like fingernails, long, hardened fingernails, testing the integrity of the wood at the very bottom of the doorframe. I froze. My lungs locked up, refusing to draw in air. Every muscle in my body pulled taut, screaming at me to run, but my feet were nailed to the floorboards. The sudden, terrifying realization washed over me. He knows I'm standing right here. The heavy knocks had been a test, a demand for attention. The silence that followed was a trap. And now, the scratching was a message. I know you're on the other side. I know you're watching. I forced my legs to move, taking a slow, agonizing step backward. My heel met the floorboard with a sickeningly loud creak. The scratching at the door stopped instantly. The silence that rushed back into the hallway was deafening. I held my breath until black spots danced at the edges of my vision. I waited for the heavy pounding to resume or for the doorknob to violently twist, but nothing happened. The figure on the other side remained perfectly, unnaturally still. I resumed my retreat, sliding my feet across the floor rather than lifting them, moving blindly backward down the narrow hallway and into the dim glow of the living room. I needed my phone. I needed a tether to the outside world, a voice to tell me I was just sleep-deprived and paranoid. My phone was resting face down on the coffee table. I practically lunged for it, my shaking hands fumbling with the sleek glass. I flipped it over. 3:45 a.m. I opened the delivery app again. The screen refreshed. The weird static map was gone. In its place was a spinning loading wheel, endlessly cycling in the center of a blank white screen. Connecting to restaurant, it read. Come on, I muttered, my voice cracking. I paced behind the sofa, keeping my eyes locked on the dark archway that led to the front door. Suddenly, the phone erupted in my hand. It wasn't a notification, it was a phone call. The vibrator motor buzzed violently against my palm and the generic ringtone shattered the silence of the apartment like a pane of glass breaking. I nearly dropped the device in sheer panic. I stared at the screen. The caller ID simply said, unknown number. Normally, I would never answer a blocked call at 3:45 in the morning, but nothing about tonight was normal. My thumb hovered over the green button. Was it the driver? Was he calling from outside the door, demanding I open it? The phone continued to vibrate, a relentless, angry buzz. I swiped right and brought the phone to my ear. Hello? I whispered, my voice trembling. For a second, there was only static, a thick, hissing white noise. Then a voice cut through. It wasn't a creepy, disguised whisper. It was the bored, slightly nasal voice of a young woman accompanied by the distinct sound of a busy kitchen in the background, clattering pans, the hiss of a grill, someone shouting an order. Hi, yeah, is this the customer at 424 Elm Street, apartment 4B? The sheer normalcy of her voice was like a bucket of cold water. It grounded me instantly. The tightness in my chest loosened a fraction. Yes, I breathed out, leaning against the back of the sofa. Yes, that's me. Are you the driver? No, hon, I'm the dispatcher calling from Midnight Bites. Look, I'm real sorry about this, but I have to cancel your order. I blinked, processing the words slowly. Cancel it? But the app said it was on the way. The driver... Yeah, the app glitches out sometimes, especially this late, she interrupted, sounding rehearsed, like she had given this exact speech a dozen times tonight. We had a system error, let a bunch of orders go through when we didn't have the staff. The thing is, we don't have any drivers available. None. Our last guy clocked out 20 minutes ago because his car broke down, so nobody picked up your order. It never left the kitchen. The kitchen noises in the background seemed to fade away. The blood drained from my feet, rushing down to my feet, leaving me feeling lightheaded and sick. "Wait," I said, my voice dropping to a barely audible rasp. "Are you absolutely sure no one left the restaurant with my order?"
"Positive," she replied, a hint of annoyance creeping into her tone. "Like I said, we have 0 drivers on the road. I've already processed your refund. It should hit your account in 3 to 5 business days. Again, really sorry for the inconvenience. Have a good night." "Wait, please, don't hang up." Click. The line went dead. The dial tone hummed in my ear, a monotonous drone that sounded like a flatlining heartbeat. I slowly lowered the phone. If the restaurant had no drivers, if my food never left the kitchen, then who the hell is standing at my door? The question hung in the cold air of my apartment. The rationalization I had been clinging to that it was just a strange, socially awkward delivery guy waiting for a tip evaporated instantly. It was replaced by a cold, primal terror that gripped my spine and squeezed. Someone had climbed 4 flights of stairs in the dead of night. Someone had walked to the very end of the isolated hallway. Someone had stopped directly in front of my door, knocked heavily, scratched at the wood, and was now standing in utter motionless silence. And they knew I was inside. I should have called the police right then. I should have dialed emergency services, locked myself in the bedroom, and armed myself with whatever I could find. That is what a sane person would do. But fear does strange things to the human brain. It paralyzes logic. It demands confirmation. The terrifying unknown is somehow worse than the terrifying known. I needed to see it again. I needed to know if it was still there. Moving with the agonizing slowness of a man walking to his own execution, I crept back into the hallway. The shadows seemed deeper now, stretching across the walls like grasping fingers. The air felt suffocatingly heavy. I didn't make a sound. I placed my feet carefully, avoiding the spots where I knew the floorboards groaned. I reached the door. The peephole glowed faintly with the sickly yellow light from the hallway. I didn't want to look. Every instinct I possessed screamed at me to turn away, to run, but my body moved on its own accord. I leaned forward, closing my left eye, and pressed my right eye against the cold glass of the lens. At first, I thought the hallway was empty. The space directly in front of the door where the figure with the bowed head had stood was vacant. A sudden massive wave of relief threatened to buckle my knees. He was gone. He had given up and left. But then my eye adjusted to the distorted fisheye perspective. He hadn't left. He had stepped back. He was standing about 5 feet away from the door now, illuminated fully by the flickering overhead fluorescent light. His oversized dark jacket hung loosely on his frame, but his head was no longer bowed. He was looking up. He was looking directly into the peephole. My heart completely stopped. I couldn't scream. My throat constricted, trapping the sound behind my vocal cords. His face was a nightmare of wrong proportions. His skin was impossibly pale, stretched too tight over his cheekbones. He had no eyebrows, and his eyes were wide, unblinking, and entirely dark. No whites, just 2 pools of ink staring with predatory intensity right through the lens, straight into my own eye. But it was his mouth that broke my mind. He was smiling. It wasn't a natural smile. It was a wide, grotesque tearing of the lips, stretching horizontally across his face, exposing far too many small, perfectly uniform, violently white teeth. It was the smile of a predator mimicking human joy, an anglerfish dangling a lure in the pitch black. He knew I was looking. The smile grew wider, the corners of his mouth twitching upwards towards his ears. He held eye contact with the peephole, with me,
and slowly, deliberately reached his right hand into the deep pocket of his jacket. He didn't break his gaze. His unblinking obsidian eyes remained locked on the tiny glass circle. From his pocket, he withdrew a small, jagged piece of metal. It caught the sickly yellow light of the hallway. A key. My breath hitched in a wet, ragged gasp. No, that's impossible. Still maintaining that horrifying, impossible smile, he took a slow, sliding step forward, then another, until he was right up against the door again, his pale, distorted face looming huge in the fisheye lens. He raised his hand. I heard the metallic scrape of the key finding the brass plate of the deadbolt. Clink. It slid smoothly into the keyhole. It was a perfect fit. He didn't turn it immediately. He just stood there, his hand gripping the metal, his terrifying face pressed close to the door, letting me listen to the sound of my own sanctuary being breached. Then, slowly, agonizingly, I heard the heavy mechanical thunk of the deadbolt rotating from the outside. My front door was unlocking.
The sound of the deadbolt clicking open wasn't loud. It was a heavy, metallic thunk, a smooth, mechanical shifting of tumblers and pins that I had heard 1,000 times before when coming home. But in this context, at this hour, it was the loudest, most deafening sound in the universe. It was the sound of a sanctuary being violently violated. It was the sound of the absolute barrier between my safe, predictable reality and the nightmare waiting in the hallway, dissolving into nothing. For a fraction of a millisecond, my brain simply refused to process it. As a writer of horror, I spent my days constructing terrifying scenarios, but I was always the god of those worlds, always in control of the narrative. Now, the narrative had broken free, and I was just the prey. The brass doorknob began to turn, slowly, inexorably. The spell of paralysis broke. Pure, unadulterated animal instinct, a flood of adrenaline so potent it tasted like copper in the back of my throat, took over. I didn't think, I moved. I lunged forward just as the heavy wooden door began to swing inward. The sickly, flickering yellow light from the hallway sliced into the dimness of my apartment, expanding across the floorboards like a creeping infection. I slammed my entire body weight against the door. My shoulder collided with the solid wood with a sickening crunch that sent a shockwave of white-hot pain down my arm, but I couldn't afford to feel it. I planted my bare feet firmly against the floorboards, the muscles in my legs screaming in sudden protest as I pushed back with everything I had. The door slammed shut with a violent crack. Click. I frantically twisted the deadbolt back into the locked position. My fingers were slick with cold sweat, slipping against the brass, but the lock engaged. I didn't stop there. Above the deadbolt was a heavy-duty chain lock, an old, rusted fixture I had never bothered to use in the 3 years I had lived here. I fumbled for the metal slide, my hands shaking so violently I could barely grasp it. I shoved the metal bead into the slot and dragged it across the track until it hit the end. I collapsed against the door, my chest heaving, gasping for air as if I had just sprinted a mile underwater. My forehead rested against the cool wood. I was hyperventilating, the sound of my own ragged breaths filling the tiny entryway. "Oh my God," I whimpered, a pathetic, high-pitched sound escaping my throat. "Oh my God, oh my God." But the nightmare wasn't over. It was just pausing. I felt it before I heard it, a vibration humming through the solid wood of the door, transferring directly into my skull. Then came the pressure. It started as a gentle, steady push from the other side, but it escalated rapidly. It wasn't the frantic pushing of someone trying to ram the door down with their shoulder. It was a smooth, continuous, immense force, like a hydraulic press slowly closing. The wood began to groan. I braced my feet again, pushing back, my hands splayed flat against the door. "Stop!" I screamed, the word tearing at my vocal cords. "I swear to God, I'm calling them right now!" There was no answer, no angry shout, no heavy breathing, just the relentless, silent pressure. Crack! A hairline fracture spiderwebbed across the wood paneling right near the hinges. The deadbolt, the primary line of defense, began to whine, the metal screws protesting against the wood.
Then, with a sickening pop, the internal mechanism of the deadbolt gave way. The lock had been forced. The door lurched inward, violently throwing me off balance. I stumbled backward, falling hard onto the floorboards. The door swung open, wide and fast, but it didn't open all the way. The rusted chain lock, the afterthought of security, caught. It snapped taut with a harsh metallic screech, stopping the door dead after opening only 3 inches. I scrambled backward on my hands and knees, my eyes wide with terror, staring at the 3-inch vertical gap of darkness. The hallway light was behind him, casting him in total silhouette. I couldn't see the grotesque smiling face anymore. I could only see the darkness of his jacket pressing against the gap. The air that wafted into my apartment through that crack was unimaginably foul. It wasn't the smell of a garbage chute or unwashed clothes. It was the scent of ancient, undisturbed dust, mixed with the sharp metallic tang of ozone and something sweet and rotting, like decaying flowers left too long in stagnant water. It was a smell that made my stomach heave. He didn't try to ram the door again. He knew the chain was holding it. Instead, he did something infinitely worse. A hand slithered through the 3-inch gap.
It moved with the terrifying, boneless fluidity of an octopus tentacle sliding through a crevice. The fingers were impossibly long, pale, and completely devoid of hair or texture. The skin looked like tightly stretched parchment, but the nails were thick, hardened, and yellowed, curving sharply at the ends like talons. These were the nails that had scratched at the base of my door. The hand reached blindly into the entryway, the long fingers feeling the air, searching. It brushed against the interior wall, leaving faint dusty streaks on the paint. Then, the knuckles bent backward at an angle that would shatter a human hand, allowing the wrist to squeeze through the tight gap. The arm was coming through. Panic, absolute and blinding, consumed me. If he got his arm through, he could reach the chain. He could slide it off the track. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing the heaviest thing within reach, a solid oak umbrella stand near the entryway. I hoisted it above my head, the weight pulling at my already agonizing shoulder, and brought it down with every ounce of terrifying strength I possessed, aiming directly for the pale arm trapped in the door gap. Smash! The heavy oak collided with the limb. I expected a scream. I expected the sickening crunch of bone. I expected the arm to instinctively yank back in pain. Instead, there was just a dull, meaty thud. The arm didn't flinch. It didn't withdraw. The long fingers simply stopped searching the wall and slowly, agonizingly curled into a fist. I hit it again. Smash! And again, smash! Wood splintered off the umbrella stand. My hands were vibrating with the impact. Finally, slowly, as if deciding the effort wasn't worth it, the pale arm began to withdraw. It slithered backward through the gap, the long fingers uncurling and trailing against the wood. The moment the fingertips cleared the edge of the door, I dropped the broken umbrella stand, threw my entire body against the wood, and slammed the door completely shut. I didn't care that the deadbolt was broken. I threw the lower latch lock, a small brass twist knob that felt laughably inadequate, but it was all I had left besides the stretched chain. I backed away, retreating into the living room, my chest heaving. The apartment was dead, silent again, save for the harsh sound of my own breathing and the blood rushing in my ears. I stood in the center of the living room, staring at the door. The wood was dented and fractured. The smell of rot still lingered in the air. He had a key. The thought finally pierced through the fog of adrenaline. The delivery app, the canceled order, the silent figure, none of it was a coincidence. He hadn't picked the lock. He hadn't broken the mechanism initially. He had inserted a perfectly cut key into my deadbolt. How? I had lived here for 3 years. I had never given a spare to anyone. Not a friend, not a partner. The only other person who had a key was the building manager, an elderly man who lived on the ground floor. I needed my phone. The dispatcher's dismissive voice echoed in my head, but I wasn't calling the restaurant anymore. I snatched my phone from the sofa. My thumbs were shaking so badly I dropped it twice before I could unlock the screen. I opened the dialer and punched in the emergency number, 112. I hit the green call button and pressed the phone to my ear, waiting for the ringing tone, waiting for the lifeline. Nothing, not even a dial tone. I pulled the phone away and looked at the screen. The signal bars in the top right corner, which usually displayed a strong 4G connection, were completely gone.
In their place was a small circle with a slash through it. No service. No, I whispered. No, no. I ran to the window facing the street, hoping to catch a signal. I peered through the blinds, looking down at the street 4 stories below. The streetlights flickered as usual. The street was empty. The world outside looked perfectly normal, completely oblivious to the nightmare unfolding in apartment 4B. Still no signal. My phone was nothing more than a glowing piece of glass. My internet connection was hardwired to my desktop. I turned towards the computer room, planning to log into a web-based calling service, email someone, do anything. But as I took a step towards the hallway, I stopped. I listened. The heavy, suffocating silence of the apartment was broken by a sound. It wasn't coming from the front door anymore. Tap, tap. It was a soft sound, rhythmic and deliberate. Tap, tap. I slowly turned my head, my eyes wide, tracking the source of the noise. It wasn't coming from the hallway. It was coming from my bedroom. My apartment is a corner unit. The front door faces the interior hallway, but my bedroom has a single large window that opens out onto the rusty iron fire escape, the fire escape that connects every floor to the dark alleyway below. Tap, tap. Fingernails against glass. He hadn't left. He had just realized the front door was going to be too much trouble. He had walked down the hall, gone out the corridor window, and climbed the fire escape. He was at my bedroom window. A new wave of terror, colder and deeper than before, washed over me. The bedroom door was open at the end of a short hallway. From where I stood in the living room, I could see a sliver of the bedroom wall illuminated by the pale moonlight filtering through the blinds. As I watched, paralyzed, the shadow of a figure slowly rose against the wall. A tall, impossibly thin silhouette, its head tilted at a severe, unnatural angle. And then, with a deafening, echoing clack, the power in my apartment died. The ambient glow of the computer monitor vanished. The digital clock on the microwave blinked out. The apartment was plunged into absolute pitch blackness. And in that utter darkness, from the direction of my bedroom, I heard the agonizing screech of the rusted window frame slowly being slid upward. He was coming inside. The darkness that consumed the apartment wasn't normal. It didn't feel like the mere absence of light. It felt physical, a heavy, suffocating liquid that had dissolved the familiar geometry of my living room. I couldn't see my own hand 2 inches from my face. My eyeballs ached with the futile strain of looking for a shadow, a glint, anything. My entire universe had shrunk down to the horrifying symphony of sounds coming from my bedroom. Clack. The sound of the window frame hitting the top rail echoed in the silence. Then, a heavy, meaty thud as something substantial crossed the threshold and landed on my bedroom floor. He was inside. My brain, usually so fertile with words, was a barren wasteland. The only thought rattling in my skull was the phrase, "The order never left the kitchen," playing on a loop. Every horror scenario I had ever written felt like a playground fantasy compared to the sickening reality of hearing boots scraping against the carpet of my own private space. Stay quiet, move silently. Survival instinct, a primal force older than language, overrode the paralysis. I couldn't stay in the open living room. I knew I had to move, but I had to navigate the apartment blind. I didn't want to make a sound, but I also didn't want to bump into something and give away my position. I dropped to my stomach. It was safer to be low. I began to slide across the floorboards, pulling myself forward with my forearms, feeling the grain of the wood under my fingertips. I didn't lift my limbs. I kept them dragging to avoid the loud, hollow thud of stepping. My heart was a maniacal drumbeat in my ears, so loud I was terrified it would give me away. I steered myself toward the small archway that led to the utility closet and the kitchen, away from the bedroom hallway. The air was getting colder. The foul smell I had noticed at the front door, the mix of decay and ozone, was now flooding the apartment, intensifying with every second. From the bedroom, I heard a different sound. Not footsteps. It was a slow, wet, tearing sound, like wet cardboard being shredded, accompanied by a guttural liquid breathing. Hiss, gurgle, hiss. I paused, pressing my cheek against the cold floor. He was doing something in there. My writer's mind, a traitor in this moment, supplied a dozen vivid images. Was he disrobing? Was he shifting form? I forced the thoughts away. It didn't matter. I had to reach the closet. I reached the threshold of the closet. I felt the baseboard with my hand. I slid my legs inside, pulled myself fully into the narrow space, and curled my body behind a stack of old magazines and camping gear. I couldn't close the closet door without risking a click, so I left it slightly ajar, creating a narrow sliver of potential visibility if any light, however faint, managed to pierce the darkness. Safe, for now. I was surrounded by the scent of dust and old plastic. I curled into a ball, my knees pressed against my chest, the broken umbrella stand which I had desperately brought with me gripped tightly in my right hand. It wasn't a weapon. It was a sliver of hope. The sounds from the bedroom stopped. The ensuing silence was a physical pressure against my eardrums. It was a listening silence. I imagined him standing in the center of my bedroom, his pale, wide-eyed face angled in the darkness, straining to hear the shallow, terrified breaths of his prey. I clamped my left hand over my mouth, desperate to stifle my own breathing. I felt the cold sweat trickling down my spine. My muscles were coiled so tight they were beginning to spasm. Thump, pause, thump, pause, thump.
Footsteps. Heavy, unhurried, and arrhythmic. He wasn't walking, he was limping or dragging a leg. The steps entered the short hallway. They were moving toward the living room. Toward me. Gurgle, hiss, gurgle. The sound of his breath was getting closer. The foul smell was now overwhelming, stinging my eyes even in the pitch black. The steps stopped right in the living room, only a few feet away from the utility closet archway. I felt the floorboards shift under the immense unseen weight. I kept my eyes glued to the tiny, jagged sliver of darkness visible through the closet door. Then, a miracle happened. The flickering yellow light in the hallway outside must have started working again. A thin, sickly yellow beam of light cut diagonally across the living room floor, managing to penetrate the ajar closet door. It didn't illuminate the room, but it created a narrow horizontal band of light. And in that band of light, I saw him. He was standing right outside. I could see only his lower half. The pale, oversized dark jacket hung absurdly low. His hands, those long, boneless hands with the yellowed talons, were splayed, pressing against the living room wall for balance. His legs were visible, and they made my stomach heave. The pants of the delivery uniform were shredded below the knee, and what I saw wasn't human skin. It was pale, mottled, and covered in what looked like tough, calcified scales. His boots were standard issue, but they looked too large for the feet they contained. He took another uneven step, and for a terrifying second, his wide, grotesque smile, warped by the yellow light, appeared in the band of illumination. He wasn't looking forward. He was scanning the room with that frozen, predatory joy. He looked directly at the closet door. My heart completely stopped. I stopped breathing. I became a statue, every cell in my body focused on immobility. I clutched the umbrella stand piece so hard my knuckles turned white. If the door moves, I strike. I strike for those black eyes. For what felt like 1,000 years, he stared at the closet door. The hiss, gurgle of his breath was the only sound. Then, slowly, as if deciding there was nothing there, his smile widened and he turned away. The heavy, limping footsteps receded, moving toward the front door. What is he doing? I heard the small twist-lock latch that I had engaged being thrown, the chain lock screeching, then a distinct mechanical click from the outside, followed by the sound of something metal hitting the hallway floor. I recognized that sound. He had locked a main deadbolt from the inside using the other copy of my key, and then he had thrown the small twist-lock latch. I wasn't trapped out. I was trapped in. He had secured the only exit that didn't involve a 4-story drop. He had locked us in together. The finally trace of hope I had been desperately clinging to, the thought of running past him and out the front door, dissolved.
I was completely sealed inside with this entity, this creature mimicking a delivery driver, this thing that knew my name, that had a key to my life, and that had never left the kitchen. The steps moved away from the front door. They were moving toward the kitchen now. My writer's brain, fueled by absolute terror, now went into overdrive. Why the kitchen? What was in the kitchen? My breathing, which had been dangerously high, now became erratic. I had to get out of this closet. I needed room to move, to hide, to plan. I couldn't be cornered in this tight space. I needed a better weapon. I needed a way to call for help, even though the phone was useless. I looked at the window. It was sealed shut, the latch painted over for decades. Even if I broke the glass, the iron bars of the fire escape were on the outside. Wait. The iron bars, the fire escape, the window. He had entered through the bedroom window. He had unlocked it and slid it up. The path he had taken in was the only path I could take out. The steps in the kitchen stopped. I heard the distinct sound of a drawer being slid open. It was the drawer next to the oven, the one where I keep the cooking knives. The sound of metal sliding against metal echoed in the silent apartment. He was arming himself. I knew my time was up. I had to act. My writer's imagination, which had been a curse all night, now became my only asset. I could picture the apartment layout perfectly in my head. Living room, short hallway, bedroom on the right, front door straight ahead, kitchen on the left. I pushed the umbrella stand piece into my waistband. I needed both hands. I began to crawl backwards out of the closet. I didn't care about the creaks now. I cared only for speed. I scrambled backwards on all fours across the living room floor, steering purely by memory. I reached the opening to the bedroom hallway. The air in the hallway was freezing, smelling almost purely of rot and ozone. I could hear his breath in the kitchen to my left, the gurgling intensifying as if he was excited. I turned right, diving into the bedroom. The room was illuminated only by the pale moonlight, and I could see the bed, the desk, and my dresser. And directly ahead, I saw it. The bedroom window was still wide open, a gaping vertical rectangle of dark city sky. The rusty iron fire escape was visible just beyond the sill. Salvation! I scrambled across the bedroom floor, my lungs burning, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. I was seconds away from the fire escape, seconds away from escaping this nightmare. I reached the windowsill. I placed my hands on the metal and pulled myself up. A hand grabbed my ankle. It was freezing, impossibly strong. Those yellowed talons dug into my skin, piercing the flesh. A cry of pure, agonizing shock escaped my throat. Order. The voice wasn't human. It was a gurgling, wet rumble, spoken directly behind me, from a mouth that was far too wide. The pale skin of his hand looked translucent in the moonlight. I kicked back wildly with the other leg, my eyes wide of terror, staring at the face hovering just above the floor in the dark bedroom. I wasn't looking at a delivery driver anymore. The moonlight caught the creature's face. The skin was pale and leathery. Those ink-black, entirely dark eyes stared up at me with zero humanity, and the wide, grotesque smile was still fixed across his face, even as his head began to twist at that severe, impossible angle. He was pulling me back down onto the bedroom floor, pulling me into the darkness. The game was over. I wasn't the writer anymore. I was just the final paragraph. The grip on my ankle was not human. It possessed the cold, unforgiving rigidity of industrial steel, wrapped in a texture that felt like wet, freezing leather. The yellowed talons pierced straight through my sweatpants, sinking deep into my flesh with a sickening, wet, tearing sound. A shockwave of pure, blinding agony shot up my leg, momentarily whiting out my vision. I screamed. It wasn't a heroic shout or a defiant yell. It was a primal, ragged shriek of an animal caught in a trap. I was half in, half out of the bedroom window. The night air, crisp and biting, whipped across my face, contrasting violently with the suffocating ozone and rot stench pouring out from the bedroom behind me. My torso was hanging over the rusted iron grid of the fire escape, my fingers desperately clawing at the oxidized metal, peeling away flakes of rust that dug under my fingernails like tiny needles. "Order," the thing gurgled again. The sound was closer now, originating from somewhere near my knees. It wasn't speaking with vocal cords. The sound seemed to bubble up from a hollow, fluid-filled cavity within its chest, a grotesque mimicry of the human language it had probably heard 1,000 times standing outside doors. It pulled. The force was astronomical. I was yanked backward, my ribcage slamming violently against the wooden sill of the window. The breath was knocked entirely out of my lungs in a harsh whoosh. I slid backward, the iron bars of the fire escape slipping from my desperate grasp. I was being dragged back into the pitch-black maw of my own bedroom. I kicked wildly with my free left leg, my bare heel connected with something solid in the darkness, something that felt like a shoulder, but with the wrong density, like hitting a sack of wet sand and splintered bones. The creature didn't flinch. It didn't make a sound of pain. Instead, the wide, impossibly stretched smile I had seen in the hallway seemed to glow faintly in the ambient moonlight spilling through the window. Its face was hovering just above my legs now. The hood of the oversized jacket had fallen back, revealing a head that was completely devoid of hair, ears, or a nose. There were only those two vast, ink-black voids for eyes, and that horrifying ear-to-ear tear of a mouth filled with rows of needle-like luminescent teeth. It was reeling me in, hand over hand. I felt another icy grip close around my calf. My right hand, flailing wildly, brushed against my waistband, the broken piece of the solid oak umbrella stand. In the sheer panic of the chase, I had almost forgotten the pathetic, jagged shard of wood I had tucked away. My fingers closed around the splintered wood. It wasn't much, just an 8-inch jagged stake, but it was the only thing standing between me and whatever abyssal nightmare this creature intended for me. I twisted my body, ignoring the searing pain in my ankle as the talons dug deeper, threatening to sever the Achilles tendon. I propped myself up on my left elbow, raising the wooden shard high above my head, silhouetted against the dark city sky. I brought it down with a guttural roar, channeling every ounce of terror, rage, and desperate will to live into my arm. I didn't aim for the hand holding my ankle. I aimed directly for one of those massive, unblinking black eyes reflecting the moonlight. Thwack! The impact was jarring. It didn't sound like wood hitting flesh. It sounded like a pickaxe striking thick, wet canvas stretched over hardened chitin. The jagged oak splintered further, burying itself a few inches deep into the side of the creature's face, right at the corner of that grotesque, stretching smile. For the first time all night, the entity reacted. It didn't scream. It unleashed a deafening, high-pitched mechanical squeal, like the sound of a train braking violently on rusted tracks. The sound vibrated in my teeth and made my eardrums throb. A thick, viscous black fluid, smelling intensely of ammonia and spoiled meat, erupted from the wound, splattering across my sweatpants and the bedroom floor. The shock of the blow forced its hands to open. The vice grip on my ankle and calf vanished. I didn't hesitate for a fraction of a millisecond. I threw my center of gravity forward, diving head first out of the window. I tumbled through the air, completely out of control, and crashed onto the rusted iron landing of the fire escape. My shoulder took the brunt of the impact, the same shoulder I had bruised slamming the front door. The pain was blinding, white-hot, and nauseating. The ancient iron structure groaned and shrieked under my sudden weight, swaying slightly away from the brick wall of the building. I lay there for 2 seconds, gasping for air, the metallic taste of blood in my mouth from biting my own tongue. Get up, get up, get up. I forced myself onto my hands and knees. My right ankle was screaming, warm blood trickling down into my sock. I grabbed the rusted railing and hauled myself to my feet. I looked back at the open window. The creature was framed within it. But it wasn't climbing out like a human would. It was contorting. The broad shoulders of the jacket seemed to collapse inward, the bones audibly popping and snapping as the entity compressed its own anatomy to squeeze through the rectangular frame. its limbs elongated, moving with the terrifying, erratic scuttling motion of a massive huntsman spider. The black fluid was still leaking heavily from its face, dripping onto the windowsill, smoking slightly as it hit the cold night air. It locked its remaining functional black eye directly onto me. The smile was gone, replaced by a gaping circular maw lined with concentric circles of those needle teeth. It lunged forward, pouring out of the window and onto the fire escape. I turned and ran. Or rather, I threw myself down the narrow, terrifyingly steep metal stairs. I didn't care about the noise. I didn't care that the rusty steps felt like they were going to give way beneath my feet. I practically leaped down the first flight, my hands burning as they slid down the rough iron handrail. Behind me, the fire escape shook violently. Clang, clang, clang. The heavy, asymmetrical footsteps of the creature were right above me. It was shockingly fast. The metallic shrieks of the structure were deafening, a cacophony of pursuit. It wasn't using the stairs properly. It was vaulting over the railings, dropping down from landing to landing, its massive, unnatural weight threatening to tear the entire fire escape from the masonry. Third floor, I stumbled, my injured ankle giving way, and I fell hard onto my knees, tearing the skin against the textured iron grid. I scrambled forward, grabbing the next railing, hauling myself down the next flight. Second floor, the stench of ozone and decay was right on my neck. It was so close I could hear the wet, gurgling hiss of its breath over the clanging metal. I didn't look back. I knew if I looked back, I would freeze. I would surrender to the paralysis of absolute terror. First floor, the final landing. There was no staircase connecting the first floor to the alleyway below. There was only a counterweighted drop ladder that was supposed to release when you stood on it. I leaped onto the ladder platform. It didn't budge. Decades of rust and neglect had fused the hinges solid. "No, no, no!" I screamed, jumping up and down on the mechanism. It remained completely rigid. A heavy, sickening thud shook the landing directly above me. The creature had reached the second floor. It was one drop away. I looked over the edge. It was a 12-foot drop to the concrete alleyway below, surrounded by overflowing dumpsters and broken pallets. A 12-foot drop in the pitch black with a severely injured ankle. I heard the screech of metal above me as the creature prepared to drop. I didn't think. I swung my legs over the railing, gripped the rusty iron with both hands, hung for a split second, and let go. The fall felt like an eternity. The concrete rushed up to meet me. I tried to bend my knees, to roll like they teach you in martial arts or parkour videos, but the darkness destroyed my depth perception. I hit the ground with a devastating impact. My left leg took the brunt of it, the knee slamming into the concrete with a loud crack that echoed in the narrow alleyway. Searing pain exploded through my lower body. I collapsed onto my side among the trash bags, the wind completely knocked out of me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. Above me, the iron structure screamed one final time. Crash! The entity landed perfectly on the first floor landing I had just vacated. The heavy iron bent under its weight. I lay paralyzed on the concrete, gasping for air like a beached fish, staring up into the gloom. It looked over the railing. The pale, monstrous face peered down at me in the alleyway. It tilted its head, that horrifying, contorted angle. It raised one of its long, palin-tipped hands and gripped the railing. It was going to drop. It was going to finish the delivery. Suddenly, a massive, blinding beam of white light swept into the alleyway. It was a garbage truck turning the corner at the far end of the street, its massive headlights piercing the darkness of the narrow corridor between the buildings. The sudden illumination was like a physical blow. The light hit the creature on the fire escape. It let out another deafening mechanical shriek, this one entirely different, filled with what sounded like genuine, agonizing pain. It threw its arms up over its face, the pale, leathery skin seeming to smoke and blister instantly under the glare of the halogen beams. It didn't drop down. Instead, moving with frantic, jerky speed, it scrambled backwards, retreating into the shadows of the first-floor landing, pressing itself flat against the brick wall, desperate to escape the light. I didn't wait to see if it would come back. Adrenaline, a final miraculous surge, flooded my system, numbing the shattered pain in my knee and ankle. I dragged myself up. I couldn't run, but I could hobble. I lurched forward, using the brick wall for support, dragging my injured leg behind me. I moved towards the mouth of the alleyway, towards the streetlights, towards the loud rumbling engine of the garbage truck. I burst out of the alleyway onto the main street, just as the truck rumbled past. I waved my arms frantically, screaming for help, but the driver, high up in his cab and listening to the radio, didn't see the bloodied, bruised man in the shadows. But I didn't care. I was under a streetlight. I was bathed in the harsh, artificial orange glow of sodium lamps. I looked back at the alleyway. It was a tunnel of impenetrable darkness. I stared into the blackness for a long time, listening. There was no sound of scuttling claws, no heavy, asymmetrical footsteps, only the distant hum of the city. The creature didn't follow me into the light. I dragged myself 3 blocks down the street, my body finally failing me just as I pushed through the glass doors of a brightly lit 24-hour gas station. The attendant, a young kid drinking an energy drink, dropped his phone in sheer horror when he saw me, covered in rust, dirt, my own blood, and the black, foul-smelling ichor of the entity. "Call the police," I croaked, collapsing onto the linoleum floor. "Please!" The sun was high in the sky when the police finally escorted me back to my apartment building. It was past 10 a.m. The brutalist architecture looked mundane and depressing in the daylight, entirely devoid of the malevolent aura it possessed in the dead of night. I had given my statement, a break-in, an attacker in a dark jacket, a desperate escape down the fire escape. I left out the black blood, the unblinking eyes, the impossible contortions. I knew how that would sound. I needed them to investigate, not lock me in a psychiatric ward. 2 officers walked me up the 4 flights of stairs. The hallway smelled faintly of damp concrete, just like always. We reached the end of the hall. Apartment 4B. The door was completely intact. I stopped dead in my tracks. My heart, which had finally started to calm down hours ago, spiked again. "No," I whispered. "That's impossible. He forced the lock. I slammed it. It splintered." The officer looked at me skeptically, then stepped forward and examined the doorframe. "Looks perfectly fine to me, sir. No signs of forced entry on the exterior." He used the master key the building manager had provided to unlock the deadbolt. He pushed the door open. The apartment was bathed in warm morning sunlight. It looked entirely normal. No black fluid on the floorboards, no broken umbrella stand in the living room. "Wait," I said, my voice trembling, as I pushed past the officers and walked into the living room. The closet. I hid in the closet. The utility closet door was closed. I pulled it open. The magazines and camping gear were neatly stacked. No signs of anyone hiding there. "The bedroom," I breathed, turning towards the hallway. I limped as fast as I could into the bedroom. The window was closed and securely locked from the inside. There was no blood on the sill, no scratches on the glass. "Sir, are you absolutely sure about what happened?" the older officer asked gently, standing in the doorway. I stared at the pristine bedroom, a cold dread pooling in my stomach. Was I losing my mind? Had the isolation, the caffeine, the stress of the writing finally induced a full-blown psychotic break? Had I hallucinated the entire thing, broken my own apartment in a frenzy, and thrown myself out the window in a fit of madness? I was about to agree with him. I was about to apologize and say it must have been a night terror. But then the younger officer, who had wandered into the kitchen, called out, "Hey, did you say you ordered food last night?" I froze. "Yes, but they canceled it. They never brought it." The younger officer walked out of the kitchen, holding a brown paper takeout bag by the top edges. The paper was grease-stained. It had the generic pixelated logo of a burger printed on the side. "Well," the officer said, looking at the receipt stapled at the top, "looks like they delivered it after all, left it right in the center of your kitchen island." The air in my lungs turned to ice. I slowly walked over to him. I looked at the bag. The grease stains were dark, almost black. The smell of the food inside was overpowered by the faint lingering stench of ozone and rotting meat. But it was the receipt that broke whatever was left of my sanity. It wasn't printed from a machine. Written across the white paper in thick, glossy, foul-smelling black fluid was a single sentence in handwriting that looked jagged and frantic, like it had been scrawled by someone who had never held a pen before. "Enjoy your meal. See you next time." The officers kept caulking, asking me questions, but their voices sounded like they were underwater. I just stared at the bag. I don't live in that apartment anymore. I broke my lease that very day.
I sleep with every light on. I never order food after dark. But I know the truth now. It doesn't matter where I move. It doesn't matter how many locks I install, because they're not just out there in the dark. They have the keys.